Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 7 of Countdown to GDPR, a podcast series where, with Jonathan Armstrong from Quarterly Compliance in the United Kingdom, we are counting down the days, weeks, and months to the go-live date for the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU and the United Kingdom. In this episode, we take a look at data security, data breaches, and the responses that you must make to these issues. Countdown to GDPR is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, back again with Jonathan Armstrong for another episode of Countdown to GDPR. Jonathan has talked about some things that you can do now to help get you ready for the May 25, 2018 go-live date for GDPR, which he's called 4 Wins. In a prior podcast, we talked about DPIAs. So in this podcast, we're going to talk about security issues that you can put in place right now. And Jonathan, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, welcome. But it really seemed to me that in your description of this, these are almost common sense security matters that you can put in place, but they're actually overlaid with a business purpose. So with that, why don't you tell us some of the things that a company can do to help security now?
Yeah, I think that's your read is exactly right, Tom. I think a lot of this is just good common sense. We should, obviously the obligation under GDPR to keep data secure appears in 2 places. It's the 6th principle. The principles are the cornerstones, if you like, of data privacy, data protection practice. And it also has a specific article in GDPR, Article 32. But basically, it's no more and no less than you will keep data secure. You'll take appropriate technical measures to keep data secure. Quite often, for many organizations, they focus on the technology. They miss the fact that still a lot of organizations have paper data. We print out a lot of stuff to hard copy. We write a lot of notes in books and in the margins of resumes, etc., etc. Obviously, all of that is likely to include personal data as well. And in many respects, many organizations are worse at handling hard copy data than they are at electronic data. Anecdotally, at least from what I'm seeing, the better the business is at handling electronic data and securing devices, then the bigger the problem it has with hard copy data. So if you look at sales guys, for example, if you make it difficult for them to log onto the system and show graphs to potential customers electronically, they know that they've only got a 30-minute slot to get that sale or whatever. So they'll print out paper just in case and guide the potential customer through it via paper. So we're seeing quite a lot of cases now where people are printing out too much stuff. It includes personal data. You don't need any specialist skills to hack into it. You just need eyes to read it or an iPhone to photograph it. And that data is very vulnerable when it's left in the back of cabs as it is, when it's left on trains as it is, when people put it into that little tray when they're going through an airport and don't pick it up at the other side. So you've got to look holistically at the way in which you handle data. And there are some really simple fixes like putting padlocks on bags that might, a $1 investment, a £1 investment could save you a significant amount of money. So a lot of it is common sense. Obviously, we're not just talking about losing data, we're talking about inappropriate access. That, for example, is one of the allegations against Cambridge Analytica, which seems to be the evidence which the UK data protection regulator had to get her warrant to search their premises, effectively saying that the data was inappropriately accessed. So under GDPR, you've got this obligation to keep data secure, but if you fail to do that, you've also got 2 potential consequences as well. The first is that you might have to tell a data protection regulator, and you might well have to tell them within 72 hours of the breach. we're likely to see some rigidity on those timelines, certainly if the experience post-GDPR follows some of the pre-GDPR cases. And then you may also have an obligation to tell the victims, to tell affected individuals. It's very important that you look at those two obligations in that order. So you're almost certainly going to want to tell the regulator first and individuals second. There might be only an infinitesimal amount of time between those two steps, but almost certainly in almost every case, you're going to want to tell the regulator first. And the regulator can exempt you from having to tell notified individuals. There is a consciousness about data breach fatigue. We obviously have obligations to tell individuals if they're affected, but we shouldn't be telling them about trivial theoretical risks unnecessarily, and regulators may be sympathetic to you not having to comply with the Article 34 obligation to tell affected individuals in some cases. But the critical thing is having your procedures in place to detect a data breach or the suspicion of a data breach. That has to work a little bit like a fire drill. You have to say to all of your employees, if you sniff smoke, raise the alarm and get out of the building. It isn't the employee's job to work out how big the fire is, where the fire is, which type of fire extinguisher to use on it. Their job is to raise the alarm and evacuate. Then you need a small team of people, maybe 10 people, who are going to be your first responders in the data breach. They need to be trained in all sorts of skills, so PR, getting to the heart of data very quickly, using technical expertise to work out the potential liability to individuals. They need more detailed training, but the key thing is to keep it simple for the general employee population. Get them to tell you when they see an incident.
So one of the things I've heard you say is typically, or perhaps that's a little harsh, often you would have a blame culture around a data breach. Why is it so important that you take that human tendency and really suppress it at the point of where you determine there's a data breach so that you can move forward?
Yeah, that's certainly my experience. In many of the breaches I see, there is a culture of silence almost initially, that people will say nothing because they think if I raise my head above the parapet, then I might well be the one who the CEO fires when all this is over or managed or before. And then there is a blame culture. I think everybody, from my experience in a real life data breach, most people have worked out that somebody is going to leave the organization as a result. And I guess the human nature of self-preservation means that once you've worked that out, it's better that you try and frame Joe or Steve or Susan rather than take the hit yourself. So in most cases I see there's a lot of internal bickering. I mean, sometimes a data breach team hasn't worked together before. They're people from disparate parts of the organization. The lawyers will say, I don't understand what the tech guy's saying. The tech guy will say, these lawyers are really dumb. They wouldn't know a laptop if it hit them in the face. There's all sorts of infighting, and that just magnifies the issues that you've got. And to deal with all of this in 72 hours is pretty unrealistic, particularly when you think you might be having to make reports to multiple regulators in multiple languages. So you need to sort the politics out in advance. I'm a great fan of rehearsing. Rehearse data breaches in as near a live an environment as you can. So put people in a rehearsal under real pressure, use real life scenarios, make them do dummy press releases. We have a data breach academy where they have to do a live 6 o'clock news broadcast with a genuine BBC interviewer who interviews them as if it was for real. And there is no substitute for experience like that. And our experience tells us that actually people who've done a rehearsal are a magnitude better at handling a breach when it comes around for real.
Jonathan, we have just a little bit of time left, but I wanted to follow up on one point you raised, and I've heard you talk about before. You talked about 72 hours. why is it so important to have a 72-hour plan as opposed to 24, 48, 62, or 110?
Because GDPR says that you ought to report within 72 hours in most circumstances. I think you're dead right that for most organisations, when you're rehearsing a data breach, we're normally saying to them, rehearse 24 hours. Try and get good to go with your decisions made by 24 hours. And the reason for that is, A, because, as I've said, this language difficulty, you might have to report to 20 different regulators on 20 different forms in 10 different languages. So there's a lot of effort in the sort of back end of making a notification. There is something under GDPR called the one-stop shop, which may alleviate that burden. But I think for safety's sake, you should assume that the one-stop shop isn't going to save you from that obligation. But the reality is as well that whenever you have a data breach, usually somebody else knows about it as well. And many of the data breaches that we handle, there is already a journalist or journalists on the trail. So quite often you're trying to amass your evidence and gather your thoughts in real time, as those people who would do you harm are also racing for the truth as well. And one of the difficulties we've seen with a lot of data breaches is often people are caught on the fly. They're having to give interviews saying what the magnitude of a breach is. Usually they're wrong. In most cases, they're significantly underestimating the number of people affected. In the odd case, they've overestimated. But you've got to get to hard metrics as soon as you can. As I say, 72 hours should be the end game. And I think for rehearsal purposes, we'd normally say rehearse it, get ready to go in 24. Then if you've got some slippage, you're still safe. But if you're rehearsing it for a 72-hour plan and your obligation 72 hours, you're in a sorry state.
So, Jonathan, thanks again. I've been visiting with Jonathan Armstrong, a partner at Cordery Compliance in London, and we've been taking a look at security issues and GDPR. Jonathan, I look forward to continuing the conversation.
My pleasure.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Countdown to GDPR. If you have any questions, you can reach Jonathan at jonathan.armstrong@corderycompliance.com. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about this most unique podcast dedicated to GDPR compliance. As the countdown to GDPR continues, I hope you will join us next week where we have another episode in our series. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening. Countdown to GDPR is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.